It's very good to be with you this evening. We're going to be looking at a verse in the Book of Proverbs. Just before we come to the specific verse, I just want to spend a couple of minutes just introducing this book, because many Christians have found the Book of Proverbs to be extremely helpful in their walk with the Lord, and especially in the days that we live today. It's a very helpful book. So one reason the Book of Proverbs is very comforting, it reminds us very clearly of salvation. If you read through the Book of Proverbs in one go, or several chapters, you notice it talks of people in very black and white terms. There are the righteous and there are the wicked. There are the wise and there are the foolish. And it's very comforting that God sees people very clearly in one of two camps. So tonight we're going to look at one warning in Proverbs, which is very relevant to today. A very big topic, in a way, a delicate topic, but it's warnings against sexual immorality. In the Authorized Versions, often referred to as fornication. And Scripture has a lot to say about this topic, so it's important that we consider this topic, especially in the context of the world we live in today. So my verse is Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 27. Proverbs 6 verse 27. Can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? And you could have one illustration. Can a man take a harlot to his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Sexual immorality, fornication, is playing with fire. That is what Proverbs tells us. There are consequences. In physics, we talk of action and reaction. To every action, there is a reaction. To every immoral act, there is a consequence. And that's especially so for sexual immorality. The context in this chapter, the context is mainly adultery, actual adultery. When a man commits adultery, he's playing with fire. There will be consequences. But Proverbs 6 and some of the surrounding chapters are actually applicable to all kinds of sexual immorality. To think that those chapters are only relevant to adultery is like saying the seventh commandment is only applicable to adultery. The fact is that the seventh commandment of the 10 commandments relate to a whole family of sins relating to sexual immorality. Therefore, pornography, it's playing with fire. Living in sin, if two people are living together without being married, it's playing with fire. If a woman has immoral dress, it's playing with fire. If two teenagers have a sexual relationship outside marriage, it's playing with fire. And there are many other verses in Scripture that talk of the seriousness of sexual immorality. Mainly I'll be dealing with it with respect to the world and non-Christians, but obviously this can also affect Christians as well. So in Proverbs chapter 7 verse 26 it says, "For she hath cast down many wounded, yea, many strong men have been slain by her." It was interesting in chapter 6, it said sexual immorality can reduce a man to a crust of bread. It's very graphic language, isn't it? The power of sexual immorality, the danger. And here it's able to wound, cast down even a strong man through a harlot or through sexual immorality. Who are the three strongest men in the Bible? King Solomon, greatest wisdom, King David, the greatest king, Samson, the strongest man. They all fell in this area of sexual immorality. And if they fell, then anyone could fall. It shows the power of that particular sin. In Romans 1, in verse 29, there's a list of the unrighteousness of the world, all the ways the world is wicked. And at the top of the list is fornication. In the book of Acts, James talks of abstaining from evil, and in his list is fornication. In 1 Corinthians 6:18, Paul says, "Flee fornication. It's a sin against the body." So this is a big sin. It's a big area where the devil attacks the world, and the devil would even attack Christians. At this point, it's worth just defining sexual immorality. Basically, any sexual activity outside of marriage. Why is this? Well, a key verse would come from Matthew chapter 5, verse 28, when a famous verse, Jesus said, "Anyone who looks at a woman with lust in their heart, they have committed adultery." The reason this is a sin for a man to look lustfully at a woman who is not his wife is because he's not married to that woman. He does not have permission to desire her, to lust after her. He's not married to that woman. We could also look at teaching on marriage itself. In Hebrews 13, verse 4, marriage is the only place for sexual activity. But when you study verses like Genesis 2:24, marriage is profound. Marriage is sacred. Marriage was one of those creation ordinances. The Bible makes it very clear. Marriage is the only place for romantic fulfillment. And marriage isn't a good way of having romance. It is the only way of having romance. But sadly, we live in a world today that has rejected God's word completely. It's rejected God's warnings about sexual immorality and rejected what the Bible teaches about marriage. The world says you do not need to be married to be in a relationship. The world says you don't need to be married to have romantic fulfillment. The world says if two people are in a relationship, they have permission to have sexual relations. It's a really, really interesting thing. I have an uncle who passed away a few years ago. He wasn't a Christian, but he thought it was really strange. When he was young, you could only live together if you were married. That gave you permission. But he said, today we have this kind of relationship culture that seems to give people permission. But it used to be only marriage. And it's quite helpful to understand how there has been a progression of ungodliness, say over the last 100 years. Things change so gradually, even as Christians, we can forget how far things have gone. So, for example, before 1900, sexual immorality was condemned by society. There was peer pressure. There was respect for biblical standards. If you then look at from 1900 to 1950, sexual immorality became tolerated. Then from 1950 to 2000, sexual immorality was allowed. Then from 2000, sexual immorality is celebrated. Now you might think that's the final stage, but it's not. Because we're just entering a period right now where if you do not support sexual immorality, you will be condemned. If you have Christian standards, you will be condemned. And I've seen examples of Christians being persecuted because they do not support gay marriage or sex before marriage. So it was condemned, then it was tolerated, then it was allowed, then it was celebrated. And we're even entering a new phase where you will be persecuted if you do not support sexual immorality. And as I said, today in the news, Prince William said he will be very happy if his children are gay. We've got to a stage where politicians and the royal family will be put under pressure by the media to make that kind of statement. They will be under pressure to say, yes, I'm happy if my children are gay. And if you don't, you will stand out and you will be persecuted. That is the state that we've got to today. Let's consider the consequences of sexual immorality. I was head of department at Bristol University, of a big department, 700 students, and also senior tutor, which meant being a counsellor to 700 students for many years. I spoke with hundreds, probably thousands of students, and I have seen firsthand the utter devastation and destruction caused by sexual immorality. Mainly amongst non-Christians, but even amongst Christians. My experience as a pastor, I've seen it amongst Christians, but most of my experience has been with non-Christians. God is not mocked. A man reaps what he sows. And when Proverbs says, can a man take fire to his bosom and his clothes not be burned? It's very graphic. It's warning us there are consequences. And the consequences can be so clearly seen in the world. My university, Bristol University, did a really important survey a few years ago. They did a survey amongst teenage girls. They wanted to know how many had been sexually assaulted, raped, or sexually assaulted. And when they looked at the results, they could not believe what the results were saying. They were astonishing. And interestingly, they didn't make the news very much, because it wasn't the news the world wanted to hear. Out of 5,000 teenage girls around 18 years old, they interviewed them and they found that 30% had either been raped or sexually assaulted. It was the most astonishing result. The reason why? These girls had been in a relationship. The boys said, because we're in a relationship, we're an item, we belong to each other, and because my girlfriend belongs to me, we're effectively in a type of marriage, and if she belongs to me, I have a right to touch her. And if she says no, I'll just overpower her and assault her. And so the consequences of sexual immorality are incredible. But the world says this is a price worth paying. One of the reasons we've had such high abortion rates in this country is because of the relationship culture. And the world says that is a price worth paying. If you say to the world, would you like to stop abortions happening? Would you like to stop girls being raped? There's a way of doing it. You follow the Bible. And the world will say, no, we don't want to lose sexual freedom. We will pay that price of millions of babies being aborted. We'll pay that price because obviously abortions are bound to happen if people have sexual freedom. We will pay that price. 30% of teenage girls, just imagine there are 1 million girls taking A-levels at the moment. Of those 1 million girls, 300,000 will be assaulted by their boyfriends because of the relationship culture, and it is inevitable. The world says, well, with education, perhaps it'll stop, but the world's in denial. All the education in the world will not stop sinful man. I could give you statistics on sexually transmitted diseases and other things, but I think I've made the point. The Bible is true. There are consequences to sexual immorality, and the world is in denial. If the world had an ounce of wisdom, the world would say, this relationship culture, sexual freedom, it does not work. It's so obvious, it does not work. But the world doesn't have an ounce of wisdom. The world does not know what makes it stumble. And so what happens in our state schools today? In our state schools, at the age of 11 and 12, children have sex and relationships education. It's not marriage. It's not sex and marriage education, it's sex and relationships education. The whole focus is you can have sex outside of marriage. That's the first thing children are taught in our schools today. You can have sex outside of marriage. Children are not told the consequences. They are not told. Young girls who are 12 are not told. You have a 1 in 3 chance of being raped or assaulted if you do what we're telling you to do. They are not told that. The devil is cruel. That is what our children are going through today. Christians have tried to go into schools. They've asked permission to go into schools and say, will you let us go into your school and teach the advantages of abstinence, the biblical way? And the government has said, Christians are not allowed, but LGBT are allowed to go in to promote gay relationships and transgender. They're allowed, Christians are not allowed. That is the world we live in today, very sadly. A few years ago, there was a letter in the Times by 30 doctors. I don't think they were Christians. These 30 doctors wrote a letter saying, dear sirs, Hollywood gives the message every day, you can have relationships, sex outside marriage, and there are no consequences. But we see the consequences every day because the consequences are horrific. They spotted something that Christians have noticed, that Hollywood lies on a daily basis. You can do this lifestyle, this sexual immorality, and you can get away with it. And the devil repeats that lie on a daily basis through Hollywood, through pop music. A lot of pop music is promoting sexual immorality, but giving the lie that there are no consequences. This is the world we live in today. It's worth just explaining another change in our society, a very subtle change in this last 100 years. Before 1900, society respected biblical standards. Now, a lot of people weren't Christians, but society respected biblical standards. And even people who weren't Christians stood up for biblical standards. There was peer pressure not to live in sin. If you lived in sin outside marriage, it was frowned upon. Peer pressure not to have relationships before marriage. Interestingly, people use the term courtship, not relationships. And I'll explain this in a bit more detail in a minute, because courtship is a friendship where you're thinking of the possibility of being joined in marriage. In particular, 100 years ago, there was peer pressure that you only ever became friendly with a person of the opposite sex if you were interested in marriage. If you were not interested in marriage, you did not try to become friendly with someone else. That biblical standards protected society. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, Psalm 33. After 1900, a big change happened. After 1900, quite quickly, people no longer looked to the Bible for standards. They looked to something else. What was that? They looked to the entertainment industry. And today, our children, teenagers, and other people, they get their standards from Hollywood. That's their teacher. That's their leader. Now we have peer pressure. And in schools, the peer pressure is intense to have relationships from a young age. And the peer pressure now is you don't have a relationship to consider marriage. You have a relationship for fun. It's now an end in itself. It's not a means to an end to think about marriage. It is an end in itself. It's to have fun. That is a really big, big change. And this is a key point. The world has ditched the term courtship. It doesn't like the word courtship. Courtship is too innocent. Courtship means I'm not in a relationship. I'm considering the possibility of a future relationship, of marriage. The world likes the word relationship because that means I am joined to someone else. We are in a relationship. We belong to each other. It's a pseudo marriage. We've made pseudo vows to each other. We belong to each other. And so young people change the relationship status on their webpage. I'm no longer single. I am now in a relationship. The biblical way is your status only changes when you're married. You're either single or you're married. A Christian should never have a relationship status change if they have a girlfriend or boyfriend. But that's how the world is. So I strongly recommend Christians to use the term courtship, not relationship. So today people say, we are in a relationship. We are an item. She is mine. We belong to each other. We are officially going out. But this is the language of marriage, and it's dishonoring to marriage. It's dishonoring to marriage for man to create an alternative to marriage. That is so dishonoring to marriage. If you honor marriage, you realize marriage is the only way to be in a romantic relationship. It's the only way to be romantically fulfilled. It's the only place to belong to someone. And as I said earlier, if you do say if a 16-year-old girl and a 16-year-old boy say they belong to each other, they're creating dangers, because if they belong to each other, there is that pressure to give away their body and their heart. We sometimes hear today people saying marriage is now under attack because of gay marriage. Marriage is now under attack. Marriage has been under attack for the last 100 years through Hollywood. And when you have relationships, there's an inevitable progression to gay marriage, to transgender, and it all ends up with Sodom and Gomorrah. That is where it ends up. But just to clarify a few things, or to clarify and summarize, why is it that sex and relationships are wrong? Because notice it's not just sex outside marriage which is wrong. It's wrong to have relationships outside of marriage. And some Christians don't understand this. You shouldn't give your heart away before marriage. You should a young man shouldn't say to a girl, I love you, I belong to you, when they're not married, they're not even engaged. You shouldn't give your heart away before marriage. Marriage is sacred and binding. Two people are joined as one flesh. You can only say we are an item if you're married. Marriage is the only time you can leave your mother and father. When young people today say they belong to their boyfriend, girlfriend, they're effectively saying they've kind of left their parents. They now belong to their partner. And there's this confusion. Are they responsible to their parents or to their partner? It creates great confusion. It's God who joins two people together. Marriage is a picture of Christ and the church. And so marriage is sacred and binding. A second reason why relationships are wrong before marriage: divorce is always bad. Malachi 2:16, God hates divorce. Why does God hate divorce? It clothes a person with violence. Divorce is a violent thing. And relationships are unbiblical because they involve divorce. When people go down the relationship path and have relationships, it's inevitable they have one relationship after another, and then they're going through relationship splits. You hear a young person saying, I've split from my girlfriend or boyfriend. Well, they shouldn't have been joined in the first place, and then they wouldn't have had a split. But one of the people there are a lot of good books on this subject, mostly from America, and an author I really like is Elizabeth Elliot. And she wrote a book, Passion and Purity. It's good to be passionate. It's good to want to be married. It's good to look for a wife. It's good to want a husband. But you should be pure before marriage. And Elizabeth Elliot said, your courtship should be so pure that if the other person isn't right, you can back away without any difficulty, with no feelings of guilt, because you're not joined together. It should be easy to back away. But today, young people at the age of 15, 16, they're so closely joined in a relationship, it's devastating when they split. It's like having a divorce. And God hates divorce, even if it's a divorce of a relationship. And relationships are very bad preparation for marriage, because in relationships, young people say, I'm bored with my girlfriend, I want another one. I'm bored, I think I could get a better boyfriend. It's not better for worse. It's not with commitment. The world loves relationships because it's the pleasures of marriage without the commitment of marriage. It's not for better for worse. When people end up getting married, they find it hard to change. If they get bored with their spouse, they want to change them. One of the biggest reasons there's been an explosion of divorce in our country is because of the relationship culture that Hollywood has promoted. That's where divorce has come from. When people have relationships before marriage, they're becoming experts in getting divorced. But one thing I should have said right at the beginning is we live in a society where many people mess up, and I come from a non-Christian family. I have messed up in this area myself. Before I was a Christian, I had relationships. There is complete forgiveness for Christians, and I never want to be making anyone feel guilty. There is complete forgiveness through the Lord Jesus Christ. Better to have a period of purity before marriage than to have none at all. But it's important we understand what is right in this area. As I said before, sex outside marriage is sexual immorality. We know that from the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 5, also Hebrews 13:4. But if you read the Song of Solomon, there are some really interesting verses in there. 3 times in the Song of Solomon, it says, do not awaken love until the proper time. We have a situation today where young people drift into relationships without any caution. And Proverbs says the righteous should choose their friends carefully. You should choose your marriage partner very carefully. And yet people rush into these relationships without any care or caution. And they awaken love without any care or caution. Song of Solomon says, do not awaken love until the proper time. And Song of Solomon speaks of kissing as being a part of marriage. Kissing is something for marriage, not for outside of marriage. Some Christians have been confused about this area, not realizing that kissing is a sexual activity. So this is an important topic for today. We have what I call a relationship culture. Peer pressure to start relationships from a very, very young age. Some Hollywood films have children starting relationships at the age of 12. And the pressure to date for fun, not because you're interested in marriage. Sadly, we see the relationship culture coming into the church. We hear of Christians having relationships, having a degree of sexual activity. There's been a recent book by InterVarsity Press promoting relationships. Very, very sad. I go around the country speaking, and I've been in churches where a single Christian girl has got pregnant. It's becoming more common, dating for fun, having relationship splits. Sometimes that causing a church split. There's collateral damage. It's not just the couple. And even sadly, I've written a book on this topic. I just grab it. I wrote this book a couple of years, God's Way for Romance, promoting purity in courtship. And the vast majority of pastors I spoke to are very supportive. But 1 or 2 pastors react against the purity movement and reacted against my book. So that's very sad.